All right, so we're going to dive into something today that's got a lot of income investors talking,
Yeah.
YieldMax ETFs, switching to weekly distributions.
Right.
And, we're not just talking about getting paid more often, although that's nice.
Yeah.
This is about potentially changing how we think about building an income portfolio with these kinds of tools.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is it's a really fascinating development because it gives you so much more control over when you're receiving that income. And as you said, it's not just about getting it more often, it's about how can you use that to your advantage.
Exactly. And, you know, for anyone who's not familiar with YieldMax ETFs,
Yeah.
they're all about using options trading to target those really, really high yields that a lot of investors are looking for.
Yeah, they've really become known for pushing the boundaries a little bit in terms of how they're generating those yields.
Yeah. And this move, it's strategic when you look at what Roundhill Investments has done with their weekly funds like UDTE, XDTE, YieldMax, is clearly tapping into something that's resonating with investors.
Oh, absolutely. Because I think what's happening is investors are starting to realize that the consistency of those payouts can be just as valuable, if not more so, than simply having the absolute highest possible yield.
It's interesting how much psychology plays into this,
Right,
right?
absolutely.
If you're seeing that income hit your account every single week, it kind of takes the pressure off.
Right.
You're not as tempted to make those impulsive trades just to chase a slightly higher yield elsewhere.
Exactly. And that stability can actually be really beneficial for the NAV of the ETF as well, because you're not having these huge swings in inflows and outflows based on people chasing those distributions.
And just to clarify for our listeners, NAV, that's net asset value. So essentially the underlying value of those ETF shares themselves.
Exactly.
So when we talk about YieldMax and these weekly payouts, they're doing it in a couple of ways.
Right.
We've got YMAX and YMAG. Those are going full-on weekly distributions.
Yeah, just straight up every week.
But then there's this other interesting element, the class funds A, B, C, and D, which distribute on specific weeks of the month.
Right. It's kind of like they're giving you this whole toolkit now.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
So before we get into the specifics of how those classes work and all the different strategies that you can use, I think it's important to step back and ask, why is YieldMax making this change now, and what are the potential upsides for investors?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think with YieldMax, it's likely a combination of things, right? You've got the competitive landscape. They're obviously seeing what's working for other funds.
Right.
But I also think there's a growing understanding among investors that when it comes to income, especially in this kind of environment, the frequency of those payouts can actually be a really powerful tool.
It's like the saying goes, it's not about timing the market, it's about time in the market.
Exactly.
In this case, it's like, it's not just about the yield, it's about when you get that yield.
Yeah, and it's not always intuitive because you see a 10% yield versus a 12% yield, and you might automatically gravitate towards the higher number.
Right.
But when you actually break it down and think about how those payouts hit your account and what you can do with them, the difference in frequency can actually have a really big impact.
So give us an example.
Sure. So let's say you've got, let's say $10,000 invested in a fund that's yielding 10% annually.
Okay.
Now, with a traditional quarterly payout, you're getting about $250 every 3 months.
Right.
But if you switch to a weekly payout on that same investment, you're looking at something like $20 every single week.
Okay, so it's like, instead of getting that one big lump sum every few months, it's like having a little bit of extra spending money every week.
Exactly. Or reinvesting it however you're using those distributions.
Right, like having that consistent cash flow to put back to work.
Exactly. And, we talk a lot about the psychological aspects of investing.
It plays a bigger role than a lot of people realize.
Absolutely. And I think this is a perfect example where just that feeling of seeing that money hit your account regularly, it just takes some of the pressure off it. It can make it easier to stick to your long-term plan.
Right, because you're not as worried about trying to time the market or chase those big swings if you're already seeing those returns coming in consistently.
Exactly.
But let's talk about some of the more practical implications of these weekly distributions, especially when we're talking about strategies like margin management.
Right, because this is where things get really interesting for investors who are using leverage.
And we should emphasize right off the bat,
Of course.
margin trading is not for everyone. It is inherently risky because it magnifies both your gains and your losses.
Exactly.
So if you're not comfortable with that level of risk, it's just not worth it.
Absolutely. It's crucial to understand what you're getting into before you even consider using margin.
But for experienced investors who use margin strategically and responsibly, these weekly distributions can be a game changer because It's like having those mini principal repayments happening all the time.
Right, exactly, because you're essentially offsetting some of that interest that you're paying on the borrowed money.
Okay, so walk us through how that works.
So let's say you've got a margin loan and you're paying, whatever the interest rate is, 7%, 8% on that borrowed money. Those weekly distributions that you're receiving from the YieldMax ETFs, they can actually go towards offsetting those interest charges.
So it's like having a built-in system to kind of help you manage those costs and potentially reduce the risk of a margin call if the market moves against you.
Exactly. It gives you a little bit more breathing room.
Okay, so let's zoom in on these two different ways that YieldMax is offering these weekly distributions.
Okay.
You've got YMAX and YMAG. Those are the ones that are just straight up weekly payouts every single week.
Right. Those are great for investors who want that simplicity and diversification. Those funds hold a basket of different YieldMax ETFs, so you're not as concentrated in any one particular area.
It's like the set it and forget it approach to a weekly income.
Exactly.
But then on the other side of the spectrum, you've got this whole other approach with the class funds A, B, C, and D.
And this is where I think YieldMax is really being clever, because they've created this system where each of those classes is assigned a specific week of the month for their distributions, but it's not tied to any kind of market pattern or prediction. It's totally arbitrary.
Yeah, it's almost like they're handing you the pieces of a puzzle and saying, all right, figure out how to put this together.
Exactly.
So at first glance, it might seem kind of random. But what you can actually do is strategically time your investments and roll those distributions from one class fund into another throughout the month.
Right. It's like creating your own weekly income ladder.
Okay, so give us an example of how that would work.
Sure. So let's say Class A distributes on the first week of the month, right? You could take that payout and immediately reinvest it into Class B, which distributes the following week. Then you take that payout, roll it into Class C, and so on. So you're essentially compounding those gains on a weekly basis.
So instead of riding that roller coaster of quarterly distributions, you're creating this smoother income stream and potentially even compounding those gains more often because you're putting that money back to work every single week.
And that's the beauty of the system, is it gives you those choices, right? You can keep it super simple with YMAX or YMAG if you just want that weekly payout and diversification.
Right.
Or you can really dive into those class funds and start experimenting with different ways to potentially boost those returns by rolling those distributions.
Like YieldMax is giving you all the tools, and it's up to you to decide how you want to build your income strategy.
Exactly. It's all about finding what aligns with your risk tolerance, your goals.
Yeah. For example, I'm thinking about a blended approach.
Okay.
Maybe using YMAX as that core holding for that consistent baseline income.
Right.
And then allocating to certain class funds strategically to try to, juice those returns a little bit.
I like it.
Of course, I'm not a financial advisor, so
Always important to say that.
always good to consult with a professional before making any big investment decisions.
Absolutely. And speaking of professionals, let's not forget to mention that no investment comes without risk.
Right?
Especially when you're talking about strategies like this that involve options trading those higher yields, they often come with increased volatility as well.
Right. And we should emphasize that because those options strategies, they can really amplify those market movements both up and down.
Exactly.
So, while that potential for those higher returns is really exciting, you also have to remember that your investment principal is not guaranteed and the NAV can fluctuate.
That's why diversification is so crucial.
Absolutely. Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
And do your research.
Exactly.
Understand the underlying assets, the funds that you're investing in their strategies.
Right. The overall market conditions, all of that plays a role.
Exactly. It's not just about chasing the highest possible yield. It's about understanding how these tools fit into a broader strategy.
Well said. So to wrap things up, I think the big takeaway here is that YieldMax's move to these weekly distributions, it's not just a minor tweak, it's potentially a whole new way of thinking about income investing.
I completely agree. It's like they have given us a new set of colors to paint with, and now it's up to us to go out there and create something amazing.
I love that analogy. And with that, we'll leave our listeners with something to think about. How might you use these new weekly distributions to enhance your own income strategy? Are you intrigued by the potential of those class funds? Let us know your thoughts, because your ideas could be featured in our next deep dive into the world of income investing.
I can't wait to see what our listeners come up with.
Me too. Until next time, happy investing, everyone.